Stop. Before you say another word of the Lord's Prayer, ask yourself this: do you really know what you're saying? Because what if every time you've recited those familiar words, you were tapping into something far deeper than you ever realized? Take the phrase daily bread. What if that isn't about food at all, but about receiving divine energy, moment by moment? What if the prayer you learned in Sunday school wasn't meant to comfort you, but to awaken you? Today, we're going to break down each line, from the very first words to the final plea, and uncover the hidden spiritual technology Jesus embedded in this ancient formula. Let's begin with the opening words, the ones that have divided Christians for centuries. When you say Our Father, you probably feel like you're following the words Jesus gave us. But here's the twist. That phrase, Our Father, is already a translation. Jesus didn't speak English. He spoke Aramaic. And the word he actually used was Abba. At first glance, that might not seem like a big deal, but it is. Because Abba doesn't just mean father in the way we think of it today. It's what a child would call their dad. Something warm, close, even playful. It's the voice of a child reaching for comfort, not the formality of a courtroom title. Now here's where it gets messy. Different Christian groups can't even agree on how the Lord's Prayer starts. Catholics say, Our Father who art in heaven. Protestants go with Our Father in heaven. The Orthodox Church, they have their own version too. Everyone insists their words are the right ones, but here's the uncomfortable truth. They're all translations of a translation. And those word choices didn't come out of nowhere. Some historians argue that the word Father stuck not because it best captured what Jesus meant, but because it served the power structures of the time. A male-only God aligned perfectly with male-only leadership. If God is a father, then only men can represent him. That idea was used for centuries to shut women out of spiritual leadership, priesthood, and influence. But go back to the earliest Christian communities. Before the councils, before the creeds, and you'll find something different. Many saw the divine as beyond gender. Not just male, not just female, something greater, something whole. So here's the big question. Was calling God Father really what Jesus wanted? Or was it what the empire needed? Because in the 4th century, when church and state became bedfellows, the hierarchy of heaven was made to mirror the hierarchy of Rome. Emperors as fathers of nations, bishops as fathers of churches, husbands as fathers of homes. And God cast as the ultimate patriarch, not because it was spiritually true, but because it kept the system running. And what does that mean for you? Think about your own relationship with the word Father. For some, it brings peace. For others, it brings pain. If your earthly father was distant, harsh, or absent, this single word might make God feel far away too. That's not a flaw in you. It's the weight the word carries. But maybe Jesus had something radical in mind. Maybe Abba wasn't about creating another title, but breaking one down. In his time, people needed priests and rituals just to speak to God. But Jesus said, no. You can speak to the divine like a child speaks to a loving parent. Directly, honestly, with no middleman. So ask yourself, when you say Father, does it open your heart or close a door? Because that first word might hold more than just a name. It might hold the key to everything we've misunderstood about this prayer. Let's be honest. When you say, Hallowed be thy name, do you really know what that means? Or are you just repeating words you memorized as a kid? Most people say it without ever stopping to ask. And that's the problem. The word hallowed sounds holy, sure, but it's also completely foreign to everyday life. You don't say your grandma's memory is hallowed. You don't call your wedding day hallowed. This word exists almost entirely in religious spaces. And when language feels distant, the experience of prayer does too. But here's where it gets interesting and a little uncomfortable. When you use words you don't understand, you hand over your spiritual power. You end up needing someone else, usually a religious authority, to tell you what those words mean. And just like that, personal connection with the divine becomes something you have to outsource. Now, let's go back to what Jesus likely meant. He wasn't quoting Shakespeare. He was speaking from a Hebrew worldview. The closest word, kadosh, which means set apart. But to ancient mystics, this wasn't just about keeping God holy on a pedestal. Kadosh was a verb, an action. an invitation to awaken the sacred that already exists inside and all around you. In that view, this line of the prayer isn't about flattery. It's about tuning your awareness, activating a frequency, saying, I recognize the divine is already here, and I want to wake up to it. Different Bible translations reveal just how muddy this line has become. King James says, Hallowed be thy name. The NIV says, May your name be honored. The Message Bible paraphrases it as, Reveal who you are. That's not just stylistic. It's a complete shift in spiritual meaning. One version puts God far away on a throne. The other invites you to encounter the divine directly within yourself. To early mystics, this line was more like a spiritual tuning fork. They believed the name of God, Yahweh, wasn't a word, but a breath, vibration. It wasn't something you pronounced, it was something you aligned with. When they prayed, they weren't begging a distant deity to stay holy. They were calibrating their own minds to divine presence, like tuning a radio to a cosmic frequency. This flips the whole idea of prayer on its head. Instead of a ritual meant to keep you obedient, it becomes a technology of awakening. Instead of reinforcing your separation from the divine, it dissolves it. Instead of relying on a priest to access meaning, you become the one who experiences it. But that leads us to a bigger question, a personal one. If this line was never meant to keep God at a distance, why has the church kept it that way? Why continue using a word no one understands unless misunderstanding serves a purpose? You have a choice. You can keep reciting words like hallowed because tradition told you to, or you can dig deeper and discover what Jesus was really teaching about accessing divine consciousness. Because if this line is about awakening, what happens when that awakened state moves into the next line? What exactly are you asking for when those next words leave your lips? When you say the words, Thy kingdom come, you're doing more than praying. You're choosing between two paths, revolution or resignation. Most people think this line is about heaven someday, about waiting quietly, being good, and hoping God shows up later. But that's not what Jesus meant, not even close. To his earliest followers, Thy kingdom come wasn't a soft, poetic phrase. It was a battle cry, a declaration of war on the world as it was. Jesus was announcing a kingdom that would replace Rome, not just spiritually, but structurally, politically, economically, socially. The Romans didn't crucify people for preaching love in the afterlife. They crucified people who threatened the empire. And this line, this prayer did just that. Imagine living under the shadow of Roman soldiers, taxes draining your family, brutality in the streets. And then someone comes along and says, there's a new kingdom coming, different king, one who brings justice, not fear. That wasn't just religious hope, that was revolutionary fire. This prayer, line by line, flipped the empire upside down. While Caesar demanded worship, Jesus said there's only one true sovereign. While Rome built peace through violence, Jesus offered peace through mercy, justice, and love. It was a spiritual takeover, wrapped in sacred language. But here's the twist. Today, many churches have neutralized that message. Instead of action, they preach patience. Instead of resistance, they preach obedience. Thy kingdom come becomes something to wait for, not something to live now. Some traditions interpret it as personal growth. Others, like liberation theologians, say, no, this is a call to action, a demand to challenge injustice, speak truth, and live as if God's kingdom is already here. Think about that divide. One group prays for change while staying safe inside the system. The other believes the system itself is the problem and prayer is how we start tearing it down. History shows how deep this goes. Abolitionists once used this very phrase to argue that slavery had no place in God's kingdom. Slave owners used the same words to defend slavery as divinely ordained. Same prayer, opposite meanings. So which is it? Is this a call to comfort or a call to confront? Because Jesus wasn't calling for quiet submission. He was teaching people to live as if the kingdom is already here, to bring justice, to heal the broken, to love the unlovable, and to speak truth in the face of power. Thy kingdom come isn't a wish, it's a mandate. So ask yourself, are you waiting for heaven, or are you helping it break through? Before you answer, consider what happens when this kingdom in motion collides with the next line of the prayer. The phrase, Thy will be done, might sound simple, But don't let that fool you. These 4 words sit on the front lines of Christianity's most dangerous theological battle, because when you say them, you're choosing between surrender and rebellion. For some, especially in Calvinist traditions, this line means handing everything over to God's control. Every joy, every tragedy, every breath, already decided long before you were born. In that view, thy will be done becomes a kind of spiritual resignation. Whatever happens, no matter how painful, is part of God's fixed plan. You don't question it. You accept it. You trust there's a reason, even if you'll never understand it. But not everyone agrees. In Arminian theology, this phrase is a call to action. It means saying, God, let me help carry out your will here, now. It's not about passively accepting the world as it is. It's about partnering with the divine to bring justice, healing, and love into a broken world. Same prayer to completely different worlds. And the split goes even deeper when you look at how churches teach this today. Some tell you that God's will is for you to prosper. Others say his will includes suffering and hardship. One group promises blessings, another calls you to endure. It's confusing, and for many believers, paralyzing. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Religious institutions often interpret God's will in ways that benefit their own power. Churches that want control emphasize obedience and submission. Movements seeking change use the exact same line to justify resistance and revolution. It's a theological tug-of-war, and you're caught in the middle. Think about it. If suffering is God's will, then fighting poverty or injustice could be seen as fighting God. But if God's will is liberation, then staying silent in the face of suffering becomes spiritual failure. This contradiction leaves sincere people stuck, unsure if they're supposed to endure or act. But there's a third way, a deeper way. Some mystics say, thy will be done isn't about surrendering to a plan written in stone. It's about tuning into divine intention already inside you. It's not about bowing down, it's about aligning up. It's not obedience, embodiment. This view turns prayer into a kind of spiritual compass, a daily recalibration. You're not asking God to take over, you're asking to become a vessel for divine love, wisdom, and action. It's not submission, it's transformation. So here's the question. Which interpretation feels more true to you? Do you believe God's will is something you accept passively or live out actively? Let us know in the comments. But first, think about what happens when this idea of divine will moves into the next line of the prayer. Because once you start living like the kingdom is real, and the will is already moving through you, what are you really asking for next? When you pray, give us this day our daily bread, what are you really asking for? Is it just about food? Or something far more powerful? This one line forces a choice: physical survival or spiritual awakening. Most churches teach it like it's obvious. You're asking God to provide what you need for the day: groceries, shelter, a steady job. And yes, it sounds simple enough. But here's what they don't tell you. The word Jesus used here, epiousios, doesn't exist anywhere else in ancient Greek. Not in literature, not in historical records, not in any other biblical passage. Just here. One word, total mystery. And because no one really knows what it means, scholars have been wrestling with it for centuries. Some translate it as daily. Others say it means essential for existence, or for the coming day, or even supernatural. But here's the kicker. No one agrees. Yet churches recite this line like it's crystal clear, even though it's built on a word that defies translation. So what if this wasn't meant to be taken literally? What if this line was a kind of spiritual breadcrumb leading the seeker towards something deeper? Early mystics thought so. They didn't hear daily bread and think food. They heard presence. They saw this bread as something alive, something divine, offered fresh every day for the soul, living connection to divine consciousness. They called it the bread of presence. It's not something you eat with your body, but something that feeds your spirit. To them, this wasn't about God dropping loaves from heaven. It was about tuning your awareness to the sacred frequency that's always broadcasting, if you know how to listen. And that leads to a radical shift in meaning. If you see bread as physical provision, you remain dependent on the systems around you: jobs, money, institutions, church leaders. But if you see it as divine energy, you begin to live from a place of direct connection. You're not just asking for resources, you're aligning with the source. So why would Jesus choose a word no one understood? Maybe because he wasn't preaching to the masses in this moment. Maybe he was embedding a key, a code for those willing to dig, a word so strange, so out of place, that it would split surface-level tradition from serious spiritual practice. Think about it. If Jesus wanted to say food, he had dozens of clear Greek words to choose from. But he picked epousios, a word so rare it exists nowhere else. Why? Because maybe this prayer was never about lunch. Maybe it's about awakening. It's about feeding something inside you that hungers for more than survival. It's about receiving guidance, presence, and energy straight from the divine every single day. So now the question becomes, when you say, "Give us this day our daily bread," are you asking for what keeps you alive? Or for what brings you to life? Drop your thoughts in the comments. But before you decide, take a breath. Because the next line in this ancient prayer might just challenge everything you've ever believed about forgiveness. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. It sounds sacred, familiar, comforting, even. But this line contains one of the most challenging demands in the entire prayer, because it doesn't just ask God to forgive you, it links your forgiveness to your ability to forgive others. And that changes everything. This isn't a one-way blessing, it's a two-way mirror. Your mercy toward others becomes the measure of the mercy you receive. And here's where things get theologically messy. Most Christian teachings, especially in Protestant circles, center on grace being a free gift. You don't earn it. You don't qualify for it. God forgives because of faith, not because of what you do. But this line seems to say the opposite. You want forgiveness? Then you need to forgive first. For centuries, theologians have wrestled with this tension. Some say Jesus didn't mean it literally. Others try to separate divine forgiveness from salvation, but Jesus doesn't give us that out. In fact, right after the prayer, he says it again louder. If you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive yours. It's not symbolic, it's direct. Catholic and Orthodox traditions accept this as part of the spiritual path. They teach that grace unfolds through cooperation, that you receive it, but also live into it. Forgiveness then becomes both a gift and a practice. But even they admit, this line is hard because it suggests that your healing is tied to how you treat those who hurt you. And in real life, that's complicated. What about deep wounds? What about betrayal, trauma, or abuse? Here's where this line has been misused. Some churches have used it to pressure people, especially victims, into quick, forced forgiveness. If you want God to forgive you, you have to forgive them. There's no room for grief, no space for healing. But real forgiveness isn't a performance. It's a process. It doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean excusing. It means loosening the grip that pain has on your soul and your time, not someone else's. And yet this line still leaves a hard truth. Holding on to bitterness blocks the flow of grace, not because God stops loving you, but because you're no longer in a posture to receive it. Forgiveness is the key that unlocks both freedom and connection, not just between you and the people who hurt you, but between you and the divine. So here's the choice. Do you treat this line as religious poetry or as spiritual practice? Because the way you forgive others may just be the doorway to your own healing. Who still lives rent-free in your mind? What would releasing that weight feel like? Not for them, but for you. Share your thoughts below. But hold on, because the next line of this prayer doesn't ease up. It dares to name something even darker. It invites you to face it head on. Lead us not into temptation. It's one of the most unsettling lines in the entire Lord's Prayer. Because if God is perfectly good, perfectly loving, why would you need to ask him not to lead you into temptation? Would a loving parent ever walk their child into a trap just to see if they fall? That's the paradox buried in this prayer's final request. And it's one that theologians have wrestled with for centuries. Some translations keep it traditional, like the King James Version, lead us not into temptation. Others try to smooth the edges. Do not bring us to the time of trial, or keep us safe from ourselves and the devil. These aren't minor tweaks. They're theological cover-ups. Proof that even biblical scholars don't agree on what this line means. At the center of the confusion is a single Greek word, perismos. It can mean temptation, but also testing, trial, or proving through fire. It's the same word used when Jesus goes into the wilderness, facing spiritual attack, hunger, doubt, not to fail, but to overcome. So maybe this line isn't asking God to keep us safe from challenge. It's asking for the strength to face it without losing ourselves. Early mystics and teachers saw this as spiritual preparation, not divine prevention. They believed the path to awakening wasn't about dodging trials. It was about becoming resilient in the face of them. Like spiritual warriors asking for armor, not escape. But traditional theology gets stuck here. If God never tempts anyone, why ask him not to? If trials help us grow, why pray against them? Some denominations respond with mental gymnastics. God permits testing, but doesn't cause it. Temptation comes from Satan, not from the Father. Others say, testing builds character, so why not welcome it? But none of these answers resolve the core contradiction. A perfect God shouldn't need to be asked not to sabotage you. That's why some scholars believe this line holds a deeper key. What if the Lord's Prayer isn't a checklist of divine requests, but a spiritual technology, not a plea to avoid darkness, but a declaration that you're ready to face it head-on? What if lead us not into temptation is actually saying, don't let me be overcome. Don't let me forget who I am. Don't let me fall into the lies of fear, power, ego, or shame. Because maybe the temptation isn't a trap set by God, but a weakness that lives inside us. And this prayer, it's your reminder to rise above it, not through hiding, but through clarity, strength, alignment. Some modern seekers have reinterpreted this line as a spiritual vow. I don't need to prove myself to anyone but God. I won't build my life on fear, control, or compromise. I choose truth. That's not submission. That's awakening. So ask yourself, do you see trials as traps or as training grounds? Because how you understand this final line might flip the entire prayer upside down. What if it's not about asking God to change your circumstances, but about asking for the strength to walk through them with your soul intact? Drop your reflections in the comments. Because if this prayer really is a guide for spiritual transformation, then every line, including this one, isn't just something you say, it's something you become. The Lord's Prayer isn't just a ritual. It's a blueprint, a hidden map for awakening the divine spark within you. But over centuries, its meaning has been buried beneath mistranslations, softened by tradition, and twisted to serve institutions that benefit from keeping you spiritually dependent. Every line, each word was meant to shift your consciousness, to connect you directly to divine presence without the need for permission, priests, or hierarchy. Now, you stand at a crossroads. Will you keep reciting the version you were taught safe, familiar, unchallenging, or will you dig deeper and ask what Jesus really meant when he gave this to his followers? This prayer wasn't meant to comfort the powerful. It was meant to awaken the courageous. If you're ready to walk that path, if you're ready to explore the layers beneath the surface, subscribe and join a growing community of seekers reclaiming the sacred for themselves. And before you go, drop a comment. Which line hit you differently today? What will you revisit, not with your lips, but with your soul? We're listening, and the journey is just beginning.